Der Klett-Cotta-Blog ist immer noch auf der Frankfurter Buchmesse. Neben mir sitzt Nigel Barley. Der hat bei Klett-Cotta, ist gerade ein Buch erschienen, das letzte Paradies. Und darüber wollen wir jetzt sprechen. Thank you very much. Welcome on the stand of Klett-Cotta.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
You are anthropologist.
I was an anthropologist. I'm sort of retired now. I consider myself a defrocked anthropologist. You still keep your old habits, yes.
And you was keeper in the British Museum.
I was assistant keeper in the British Museum.
Yes.
I looked after the African and the Indonesian collections, which makes no logical sense, but it just happened that way.
This book in English, Das letzte Paradies, in English the title is The Island of Demons.
That's right.
And where does the title of Demons come from?
It's really a sort of homage to a film that Walter Speas made with von Plessen, the German director, called Insel der Dämonen, which was quite literally about the demons that live in Bali. And when I wrote the book, it was, if you like, an ironic reference to that. It was about the demons that the Westerners brought with them, that they thought they'd left behind, but which actually accompanied them to Bali.
The first time your book is a portrait of Bali. Is it so?
A portrait of Bali as it was experienced at that time, and as it was presented to the world by Walter Speas, who was absolutely central. He didn't invent the idea of Bali as paradise, but he made it known and he projected it out into the world through his contacts with opinion formers and his paintings and his friendships.
Who is Walter Speas?
Walter Speas was a Russian-born German. Yeah, all his life apparently he spoke German with a Russian accent. He was one of those infuriating people who could do anything. I always think of him as a golden butterfly. You're very lucky if you meet one person like Walter Speas in your life. He was handsome, intelligent, charming, gifted, absolutely hateful. And he was a choreographer, an anthropologist, a linguist, a filmmaker, a natural historian, and of course above all an artist. But above all of that, he was a fine example of that word that German has given to the world, a Lebenskünstler. And so there are two myths associated with Walter Speas. The first is the myth of Bali as paradise, and the second is the myth of Walter Speas himself, which is that, you know, a man can go off to the other side of the world and live life entirely according to his own wishes and desires, not worrying about his mortgage and his pension scheme and all the terrible things that could happen, set beauty at the middle of his life and be happy.
Very much artists come to see him.
Well, a lot of people, artists, musicians, filmmakers and so forth, flocked to Bali, and they all stayed with Walter Speas. And people who were very famous then, many of whom are not so famous now. But I mean people like Charlie Chaplin, the conductor Stokowski, the famous anthropologists, of course, Margaret Mead and Bateson.
Noel Coward?
Noel Coward came too, and Ellie Beinhorn, of course. Really an enormous cross-section of the rich and famous and the opinion formers of his age. And of course Barbara Hutton, the richest woman in the world, came and sort of fell in love with him. And Vicky Baum, the famous author of, we mentioned him, Hotel, also fell in love with him. People queued up to fall in love with him.
It's the first time that I speak about Vicky Baum in an interview.
And she wrote her famous book, Liebe und Tod auf Bali, in Speas' house, drawing heavily on his own ethnographic researches. So he really knew everyone who was important to know in that age.
There's also Rudolph Bonnet. Who is it?
Rudolph Bonnet, yes, he was a Dutch artist who was Speas' neighbor. When I was writing the book, the hardest thing often when writing a book like that is to find the voice. And I thought, well, I could write it in the first person.
Find the real sound of the voices.
Yes, that's right. And if I'd written it in the first person, it would have been as Speas, as I say, that wonderful golden butterfly. And I thought, that's not me. And then I looked around and I found Bonnet, who was small-minded, judgmental, self-hate. I thought, that's much closer to me. And of course, by telling the story of Speas through the mouth of Bonnet, you get a sort of a nice ironic distance.
Speas influenced local painters and took part in the evolution of the stance Kajak. What is this for some story?
Yes, Speas was one of those people who could talk to anyone, from the highest to the lowest. He, of course, was a very gifted linguist. He spoke fluent Balinese and Indonesian and so forth. And to this day, I mean, if you're talking to Balinese painters, they will tell you, oh yes, my father had an affair with Walter Speas, or my uncle, or whoever it was. It's sort of part of, you know, being a stamp of authenticity as a proper Balinese painter. He set up this cooperative together with Bonnet, which sort of trained and developed and organized Indonesian painters. He gave them a new way of painting and a new market. But I mean, Speas being Speas, of course, also learnt from them, whereas Bonnet was keen on teaching, Speas was keen on learning. And the Kecak dance is also something which shows his enormous empathy with the Balinese. It's based on a traditional temple dance, but sort of dramatized and made much more spectacular by Speas and developed with a Balinese dance called Lembak. And it was for that film, Island of Demons. And to this day, if you go to Bali, you will see it being performed for the tourists in the temple at Uluwatu, and they give you this spiel about the famous Kecak dance, unchanged for 1,000 years. It's rooted in the mists of time. And you say, well, actually, most of it was Walter Speas in 1932. But there you are. I mean, he was so in empathy with the Balinese that he sort of blended in, and they've taken it over and made it their own.
Bali was a real paradise, or was it rather a myth created in the imagination of people?
There are no real paradises. No place is real paradise. If a place really had all the characteristics of paradise, we would get bored there, and therefore it would cease to be paradise. The secret of paradise is it's always somewhere else. It's just over that
imagination
hill, on that corner. It's a place of the imagination entirely. Yeah.
Yes. Many intellectuals and artists followed Speas and had was influenced by him, nicht?
Oh, yes, and I mean a whole school of Indonesian painting. I mean, if you go to Ubud, which is the cultural capital of Indonesia, it's so because Speas was there to this day. I mean, we are still following in Walter Speas's footsteps.
And he assisted in the foundation of a Balinese artistic cooperative.
That's right, yeah.
With the name Peter Maha.
Yeah, the Great Shining, which really tried to keep up the quality of Balinese paintings and made sure they got fair prices and really organized the whole thing in a very methodical way, which is sort of untypical of Walter Speas. I mean, he wasn't a very methodical man. He was delightfully... I mean, there's a lovely story about after he got out of prison. While he was in prison, his house was taken over by a stern Central European lady who had it thoroughly scrubbed from top to bottom, fired all his lazy servants and hired new, properly trained, efficient ones. And the minute he came back, he sent them all away, took back his old staff and had a big party. And I think he says something like, and now my house is filthy again and full of laughter. And that sums him up.
At the end of Speas?
He fell foul of the Dutch authorities, who were having certain problems with Germany in Europe at that time, and so they decided to break him. So they put him in jail for homosexuality, and then when he got out of jail in 1938, they interned him as a German national. All his life he had the wrong passport. During the First World War he was interned in Russia because he also had the wrong passport for there. And they then put him on a ship to send him to a prisoner of war camp or an internment camp in Ceylon. And unfortunately, the ship was sunk by a Japanese bomber, and he went to the bottom of the ocean. And it's ironic that the people who were on deck in the hot sun tended to survive, but Speas, who'd made friends with his guards and who adored him and therefore gave him a cabin, was locked in and drowned.
Anke Berger hat dieses Buch übersetzt, das letzte Paradies von Nigel Barley, und es hat Ihnen auf die Weise ein besonderes Lesevergnügen bereitet. Herzlichen Dank.
Bitteschön.